record. Okay. And then I'll turn it over to Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so nice to be with all of you today to chat preschool for the next hour or so. There is a lot of information to go through regarding preschool LRE, so I'm going to talk quickly, but I will stop and pause for questions along the way. So please don't hesitate to ask if there's something that you need clarification or more information on. Again, if you have not signed in yet, the link is posted in the chat as well as a link to the PDF of this presentation. So just a reminder for housekeeping norms, we are recording today. Please keep your questions general rather than district specific, and please limit your technology use during the presentation. Just a reminder, here's your full SST2 special education team. So Jen and Melissa are on the call with me today. Kristen Fazio is our director. And again, I am Courtney. All right, so we're going to start out with just a general overview about LRE. So as most of you know, Section 11 of the IEP centers around least restrictive environment. At the preschool level, before finalizing this section, the team should have a thoughtful, data-driven, child-centered conversation about LRE requirements and how they apply to the individual child. So before we jump into documenting the LRE outcome in Section 11, let's review the preschool LRE requirements and best practices. So LRE is the legal requirement that children with disabilities be educated in the same environment as children without disabilities whenever possible. The legal requirement comes from IDEA and our state operating standards. And note that this is the same rule for children with disabilities from ages 3 through 21, so includes preschool. To meet these requirements, each district must ensure that a continuum of placements as identified in Ohio rules is available to meet the needs of children with disabilities. So looking more specifically at preschool special education requirements, each district has to make a continuum of options available that is specific to preschool. To help make sure that the school districts are aware themselves of what options they are making available, and then of course to make sure that families know as well. So the list needs to include, and I'm going to switch to the graphic of it, all options from 1 through 6 on this continuum. We're going to discuss them in more detail in a moment. There's going to be a link posted in the chat of a template that you can use to list and post your district-specific LRE placement locations. Jen or Melissa, would you guys mind grabbing the stuff to post in the chat?
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you. So this is the first of many resources that will be shared during the presentation. Rest assured, you'll be able to access all of them through a link at the end of the webinar as well. So this list should be updated annually, and it needs to be publicly posted by the district, and it should also be on hand as the IEP team, including the parent, determines LRE placement to complete Section 11 of the IEP. The first option on the list is the best practice option. As you complete your own internal continuum of services, you can leave this part blank, and we'll talk about it more in a minute. The first option, which is a general education setting, must be included on your continuum. The second option is required to offer, but you can leave it blank if you already have Head Start and non-public classrooms listed under your first option, okay? For options 3 through 6, starting with integrated all the way to home and service provider location, the district must have options for all of those placements. Those sections cannot be left blank. The best practice option may be required if the child is already participating in a general education classroom. According to preschool special education rules, if a child already participates in a regular early child setting at the time that they are identified as a child with a disability, the child should remain in that program unless the IEP team determines otherwise. And in that case, they need to provide a thorough justification for that. So even though a district does not have to have this option available to offer, it might be a setting required as the starting point to consider as the LRE for a particular child. Keep in mind, though, that there is a requirement for the district to offer 360 hours of general education instruction anytime a child is placed in a classroom setting. If the child's current classroom at the time that they qualify does not have a curriculum, it does not qualify as a best practice option, and it does not need to be considered first by the IEP team. Additionally, note that the caveat of with natural proportions is included. Again, if the child's current classroom is already serving, for example, 8 students with disabilities in a group of 16 total, it does not meet the definition of natural proportions, and it does not need to be given priority consideration. The team could still choose it as the child's LRE, but keep in mind that the district would be responsible to offer the 360 hours of instruction or 1 hour of SDI combination gen ed. If you're coding that through EMIS as an IE 72, but that gets into more restrictive setting questions. Another piece to consider is the option of play groups, which are commonly referenced within our region. Note that bringing a child in for a play group once a week is considered the most restrictive setting of service provider location. Preschool classrooms are designed for children ages 3 through 5. If a 3-year-old isn't ready for a classroom setting, especially if this is a pattern within your district, think about making adjustments to the classroom to make it more developmentally appropriate for your preschool age children. Keep in mind that the district is not required to operate all of the options on the continuum. The district only has to be able to offer each option. And so the district must have a plan for where the child could go if such an option were needed. These options could be in the district or outside the district. This list of available options is what the district needs to have available in case a child needs such a placement. And this graphic here just outlines some flexibility that you can have within your own programs to ensure that you can offer as many options on the continuum on site as possible. Additionally, you can look at partnering with other agencies or providers to provide the full option, the full continuum, I should say, within your district. This could include partnering with ESC preschool programs to offer some or all of the options on the continuum, partnering with your local Board of Developmental Disabilities, and contracting with neighboring school districts to be your district of service and deliver those special education services. You can also partner with neighboring school districts to create a consortium and operate a central preschool at one location. So that was already a lot of information. So I do want to stop and pause for any initial questions that you may have around LRE requirements. Okay, I will keep us moving along then.
I see nothing in the chat.
Thanks, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so there are actually a lot of benefits to inclusion settings, which is why LRE is so emphasized at the preschool level. Including students in the general education setting whenever possible can have a positive impact on a child's language skill development. Research has shown that children in inclusive settings have greater cognitive, communication, and social emotional skill development compared to those in separate settings. It's been found that children with disabilities who are placed in inclusive settings actually have a similar level of engagement during classroom activities when compared to their same age peers. Children have more practice opportunities in inclusive settings rather than separate settings. It's been found that children in inclusive settings have higher attendance rates than students in separate settings. In the long term, they demonstrate higher reading and math test scores. And finally, it's also beneficial to their same age peers. Those children have better developmental and social outcomes when they have the opportunity to interact regularly with students with disabilities. I'm going to go ahead and post in the chat this link to preschool inclusion. All right, so just a quick piece of information. One of the other reasons that inclusion is so important is because it sets children up for success in kindergarten. So this graphic just takes statewide data from the 21-22 school year, comparing how many students at the preschool level are served in regular education settings as compared to kindergarten. And you can see that at the preschool level, we have almost 4 times the number of children placed in separate settings compared to early elementary. Also, keep in mind that the regular education blue bar includes integrated classrooms, which the state does not consider to be general education. So, if you were to remove integrated classrooms from that percentage on the blue bar, it would substantially increase the number of students being served in separate settings. So there's a major disconnect between how we're serving students in preschool versus kindergarten. And this can pose some real challenges when children hit school age. If they've been in an environment where they've had access to an intervention specialist all day long and a smaller class size all day long, and then they're moved to a general education classroom in kindergarten with only access to an intervention specialist for a short window of the day and a larger class size of, likely 25 or so students, it's easy to see why those children would struggle. So as much as possible, we want to serve our students in the environment that is most like what they will transition into at the kindergarten level. To ensure compliance with LRE requirements, preschool IDEA monitoring has been developed. When a district is selected for more intensive levels of tiered monitoring, the Department of Children and Youth's preschool special education team relies heavily on Section 11 and the PRO1 to determine compliance. So this is just a screenshot from one component of the monitoring progress. You can check the criteria to see how you're doing and then plan for how you can work to meet the criteria or work to improve on what you already have. The criteria for this item is that the district makes a full continuum of options available, that continuum that we've already discussed. So if you don't already have this, it is something to work on. And then we'll also be looking at how the district is making placement decisions. So the next piece of monitoring, given that a district has a clearly documented continuum of options, then do they make sure that their staff understand what the options are and how to make placement decisions? Does the district provide some sort of professional development or staff updates to make sure that all staff, including new staff, are aware of the options on the continuum and how to make placement decisions? This question essentially asks if the district is using the list of continuum options that it has created. So when you're having an IEP team meeting, do you have that written continuum of options available? And building off of all of that, this question is about the district making placement decisions by beginning with the first point on the continuum of options. In other words, all conversations about least restrictive environment and placement for preschool students should start with general education, rather than saying, for example, well, we have a special education classroom on site, and since that's the space we have, that's where your child is going. Where the state is really saying, we need to consider as a team the general education classroom first and eliminate that as an option before we consider more restrictive settings. So with that, I will pause again to see if there are any questions.
I'm seeing nothing in the chat. Feel free to unmute or type in your questions.
Okay, I will keep us moving along then. The Department of Children and Youth has created a tool to support LRE decision-making according to special education law. Your IEP teams may find this document especially useful if you anticipate that there may be disagreement from one or more team members about placement. This resource organizes the group discussion around the continuum of services and ensures that the team considers and eliminates the general education classroom as an appropriate placement option before proceeding to more restrictive settings. It essentially writes your justification for a more restrictive setting live in the meeting. This document also saves home and service provider location until the end of the discussion, thereby illustrating to the team that both are considered the most restrictive settings for preschool. It is important that placement options are not eliminated just because the district is unwilling to offer a certain accommodation or support in the general education setting. This table illustrates the various types of accommodations and supports that can be considered by the team when determining LRE placement. I suspect that most of you on the call this afternoon understand accommodations thoroughly, so I am not going to go through this in detail, but I did drop some resources in the chat. Even with the LRE guiding questions form, there are still considerations the team should keep in mind. Remember that parental placement does not exist in preschool. Placement should be an IEP team decision rather than one that is made unilaterally by the district or by the parent. The district has a responsibility to advocate for the child's best interests rather than simply appeasing the parent by agreeing to an LRE that cannot be adequately justified. The LRE guiding questions document can help foster shared understanding of LRE and steer the discussion to considering less restrictive options first. When the district has made a placement recommendation based on data and the parent disagrees, there are several options that the team can consider. The parent can decline services altogether. The parent can use the dispute resolution process, or the team can agree to start in the setting that the parent believes is the best fit. But be careful. We want to make sure that we do that with the understanding that the team will reconvene to review data and reconsider LRE in a reasonable amount of time. This option might be appropriate, for example, if the parent believes that the child will be traumatized by being sent to school with unfamiliar caregivers. The parent therefore requests that the child receive temporary services at home so the child can become comfortable with the intervention specialist and related service providers before beginning school. Note that this option should not be a common practice, though. And remember, you want to reconvene the team to reconsider that LRE in a reasonable amount of time. Particularly if you anticipate a contentious LRE discussion, you may want to provide a short document on LRE requirements and best practices to families prior to the IEP meeting. A sample resource has been pasted into the chat, but note that this is not an official document from the Department of Children and Youth or the Office of Exceptional Children, and you may prefer to develop your own resource that is tailored more specifically to your district or program. All right, once again, I will pause for a minute to see if there are any questions. Okay, I'm going to move us right along then. I guess I can start talking a little slower. I thought I'd be short on time here. All right, in most cases, only the for preschool portion of Section 11 needs to be completed. The only instance when both the preschool and school age sections will be completed is when the team is writing a combined IEP that will cover portions of both preschool and kindergarten. And I dropped a link in the chat to a guidance document that may help you navigate those preschool to kindergarten IEPs. All right, so this nice little graphic that was developed by DCY illustrates what specific questions need to be answered in Section 11 based on how you answer the questions that come before it. So based on your answer to the first question of the child attending a general education setting, it takes you down 2 columns to tell you what you need to do next. So let's take those one at a time. In this first scenario, you can see that the first 2 questions are answered as yes. This would apply if the child is placed in a best practice or first placement option location, and if the child is receiving all of their services embedded within regular classroom routines and activities. It's important to note here that pulling just a student or students on a service provider's caseload away from classroom activities to do something else in another part of the classroom does not meet the threshold to answer the second question as yes. To answer yes, all services should truly be push-in rather than pulling the child away from what they otherwise would be doing. This scenario applies if the child is being pulled away from their general education instruction or activities to work somewhere else with a service provider, whether it's within the classroom or in another location. Note that pulling a child away from their general education activities for the majority of their specially designed instruction is coded differently through EMIS and impacts the district's Indicator 6 performance on the SPP. We'll talk more about this later. Finally, if the child is being served anywhere other than the best practice or first placement options, the answer to the first question in section 11 is no. Note that the answer should be no if the child is placed in an integrated classroom. By federal and state definitions, an integrated classroom is not a general education setting. As with pull-out services, there needs to be a robust justification for why the child is not being served in the general education setting. Additionally, if the child is still receiving pull-out services, even when placed in a more restrictive setting, for example, the speech and language pathologist takes a child away from a special education classroom to receive services in a therapy room, that also needs to be justified in this section. What this guidance does not mean is that your justification statement should say, Charlie Brown's team gave adequate consideration to meeting his needs in the general education classroom with supplementary aids and services. However, the nature of his disability is such that education in general education classes cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Okay, so it cannot just be a copy and paste of all of these statements. Your justification needs to describe or tell the specific story of Charlie in relation to the components. In other words, it should be an individualized justification. Let's take a look at some sample justification statements and think through which ones fit the criteria we just reviewed. And you're welcome to unmute and or give some reactions in the chat with thumbs up, thumbs down. So here's the first example. Team agrees that Grover needs a smaller class setting. Due to the intensity of his needs, he can't make progress in the general education classroom, even with supplementary aids and services. Thoughts on this one? Okay, I'll just tell you, it is not compliant in the eyes of the state. That is not specific enough, not individualized enough to Grover's unique needs. All right, second option, because he needs assistive text, such as a picture schedule for a STEM board and a tablet for communication, Oscar's least restrictive environment is a special education classroom. Once again, this would be considered non-compliant as a justification because it does not adequately specify why those supports cannot be provided in a general education setting. And finally, for a preschool justification, this one, Elmo has sensitivity to sound. Team agrees Elmo needs noise-reducing headphones to access general education, but he does not tolerate wearing them for more than 2 seconds. Without headphones, volume of general education causes consistent distress, even when other supplementary aids and services are considered. Therefore, the team agrees that the quieter integrated setting with no more than 8 students is Elmo's current LRE. Headphones will be trialed in this setting several times per day. That would be considered an adequate justification in the eyes of the state because it really answers all of those questions that we looked at on the earlier slide. So if the team is not able to provide that detailed justification as to why services can't be provided in gen ed and what that smaller classroom setting offers, the team may want to come back to the table and determine if that more restrictive setting is truly the LRE.
Courtney,
Questions about this piece? Go ahead, Joey.
Sorry. Just on that last little piece of that last one, didn't we talk about, it says 360 hours of general education instruction and 1 hour of specially designed instruction per year. Didn't we say that had to say 1 hour per week of the specially designed instruction?
Oh, you're right. Thank you. I do need to go in and fix that. So to Joey's point here, we're looking at this specific portion here. So it's 360 hours of gen ed instruction per year, but the 1 hour of specially designed instruction embedded within that is per week. So thank you for pointing that out, Joey. I appreciate it.
Okay, I just wanted to double check that I had understood that from our other training correctly. So
You've got it.
okay, thank you, Courtney.
Sure. Other questions or comments that I can answer?
I don't see
Okay.
anything else in the chat, Courtney.
Thanks, Jen. All right, I will keep us moving then. So looking at the question of who provides the child with instruction in the gen ed curriculum, this question only needs to be answered if the child is not being served in a best practice or first placement option location. In other words, if the child is not being served in a general education classroom. The intent of this question is to make sure that the child is actually receiving general education instruction, not just special education services. 3 areas must be covered in the response to this question. The first is the role of the person providing instruction in the gen ed curriculum. The second is how that person is providing access to the gen ed curriculum in the child's area of need as identified in the IEP. And the third component is the amount of time and frequency of the general education instruction. And this chart here alludes to what Joey had mentioned earlier about the amount of instruction that is required in state law for services provided in a classroom versus services provided at home or in the service provider location. If the person providing the general education instruction is qualified to be the lead teacher of a public school preschool general education class or a public school preschool special education class, then you simply list that person's role. For example, if an itinerant early childhood intervention specialist is providing preschool general education to a child at home, then the role, early childhood intervention specialist, would be listed in response to part 1 of this question. If the person providing the general education instruction is not qualified to be the lead teacher of a public school preschool general education class or a public school preschool special education class, then a qualified staff member will need to consult with that other person. The roles of both individuals would need to be listed. For example, it could say the SLP with consultation from the preschool general education teacher. In addition to identifying the role of the provider, you must also describe how that person is providing the child with access to the general education curriculum. For a child being served in the home or service provider location, it is important to identify if the special education services will be embedded within the general education curriculum and provided together at the same time, or if the special education services will be provided separately from the general education instruction. This description should also identify which part of the general education curriculum and/or which early learning and development standards are being addressed in the child's area of need as identified in the IEP. Finally, you must list the amount of time that the child will be receiving instruction in the general education curriculum. According to rule, a child served in any setting other than home or service provider location must be provided a minimum of 360 hours of programming per year, which must include instruction in the general education curriculum. To document that this requirement has been met, the IEP should clearly identify the number of hours per year that the child will be in a program receiving general education instruction. If a child is served in the home or service provider location, then the rule states that the child must be provided a minimum of 1 hour of instruction per week in the general education curriculum that includes specially designed instruction. To document that this requirement has been met, the IEP should clearly identify how many minutes per week the child will be receiving specially designed instruction and related services, and how much time the child will be receiving instruction in the general education curriculum. If special education services will be embedded within the general education curriculum and provided together, then a total amount of time will meet the requirement. If the special education services will be provided separately from the general education instruction, then there must be a separate statement of the number of minutes per week for the special education services and a separate statement of the number of minutes for general education instruction. Any questions about how to document who is providing instruction in the gen ed curriculum or how to document time and frequency? Okay, moving us along. The PRO1 should document the agreed upon LRE placement using terminology from the continuum of services visual that I showed you earlier. For example, if you land on option 1 of the continuum, public school preschool general education class, you would use that exact terminology in the PRO1 to document the agreed upon LRE placement. The PRO1 should also document the specific location of services that is aligned with that placement. For example, the child will access the public school preschool general education class at the Lorain County Early Learning Center. If the LRE placement and location are not a general education setting aligned with either best practice or the first placement option, the PRO1 should also include the justification for why the child cannot receive special education and related services in that first placement option, and or why the child cannot attend a general education setting. In other words, your Section 11 justification should also be reflected in the PRO1. The PRO1 must also include justification if the child is receiving less than 360 hours in a general education setting and or less than 1 hour of specially designed instruction per week. This should include an explanation, if appropriate, of the offer that the district made to deliver that 360 hours in a general education setting. The deviation from the required number of hours should be rare. An example of when this would be appropriate is if the child has a significant medical need that causes him to fatigue easily, so he cannot tolerate the required hour per week of SDI at home. A non-example would be the child being just speech and language impairment and therefore not being provided the minimum amount of instruction. As with any component of the PRO1, it is always beneficial to reflect the parent's contribution to the LRE discussion and decision. That prior written notice must be provided to parents after the IEP meeting, but before the implementation of the IEP. Please make note of that as it is unique to preschool. PRO1 must be provided to the parents after the IEP meeting, but before the implementation of the IEP. I'll stop again for any questions regarding general education documentation or the PRO1. Okay, I will keep us moving. You guys are troopers. I thought this would be information overload. All right, so just like all other components of the IEP, LRE is part of what we consider to be a working document. And what that means is LRE can change anytime, and it should change if the data reflects that. So the data that you are collecting should drive ongoing conversations regarding every student's LRE. So it's very common at the preschool level to say, well, our children started in whatever classroom in August, so they're going to stay in that classroom until the next school year, and then we'll change their LRE. If the data is telling you now that the child could potentially be successful in a lesser restrictive setting than where they are currently placed, the IEP team should, in all likelihood, reconvene to amend the IEP to, or at least consider a less restrictive setting. Okay, I am going to post in the chat a compliance calculator for indicator 6. So if you are not aware, LRE placement directly aligns to indicator 6 of the special education profile. This table reflects the differences among the indicator 6 federal reporting categories and what needs to be reported in the IEP. So we have the preschool rule that tells us what the continuum of options is. and the district should use their continuum to guide their placement decisions during IEP meetings. As you look at how to report that information through an EMIS code, you want to make sure that you are using this chart to report accurately. If the majority of services are being provided in a regular education setting, you would be using codes IE 51 or 55, or if the program's less than 10 hours a week, 53 or 56. Note that for reporting purposes through EMIS, an integrated classroom is included. For the purposes of answering the remaining questions in section 11, though, an integrated classroom, as well as classrooms on the second placement option, are not considered to be general education, and they require more robust justification. When you are looking at your own district's special education indicator results, specifically for indicator 6, be aware that the targets continue to increase. For this year's 24-25 special education profile that will be released this spring, the data will come from the 23-24 school year. You can see that the targets for the upcoming SPP are the percentage of students receiving services within the regular education class, at least 73%. The percentage of students being served in a separate setting, no more than 14%. And the percentage of students receiving services at home, no more than 2.2%. And as we move along the targets, you can see that these numbers, where the expectations, increase substantially over time. So this data looks specifically at our region within SST2, and this data reflects the 22-23 school year. The first bullet from each section is taken directly from our 23-24 SPPs. The second bullet applies our regional performance to the anticipated 25-26 targets. While inclusion is first and foremost a best practice for our students, the amount of students we serve in a regular setting also directly impacts our SPP data. This graph compares how our region performed on indicator 6 as compared to statewide performance. You can see that our region lags behind the state, particularly when it comes to the amount of preschool students that we are serving at home. So it's wonderful that you chose to be a part of this conversation today to consider potential enhancements that you can make to your practices. Applying that same data to the 25-26 indicator targets, you can see that Region 2's delay is anticipated to continue to exist. So this graph really illustrates the importance of being intentional within our region and how we're using data to inform initial and ongoing placement decisions. All right, I will pause to see if there are any questions specific to indicator 6. Okay, I will keep us moving along. So a couple of extra points regarding LRE. If the team determines that a general education setting is the child's LRE, note that the school district of residence is required to make FAPE available. So in other words, if the general education setting is within a community preschool program, and that's what the IEP team agrees upon, the district is required to pay for the time that the child is in that program in order for the district to deliver FAPE. The second question, can the parent choose the LRE? For example, can they choose a special education setting over their preschool, community preschool program? Remember, there's no such thing as parental placement in preschool. Neither the parent nor the district can unilaterally decide a child's LRE or placement. So here's an example. I will give you all just a minute to kind of read through this scenario with Jessica, and then we'll talk about what the district needs to do to be compliant in this situation. All right, so Jessica's LRE has been determined that to be a general education setting, and she's going to continue to attend a non-public school since the district only operates a special education class. So here are the options that the district could potentially consider. So take a read through those, and then we'll talk about which one is accurate. And if anyone would like to take a guess in the chat or unmute, you are welcome to do so. All right, the correct option is 3. The district of residence is responsible for FAPE and the cost of the program at the non-public school. The school must pay if they do not have a comparable option within their own preschool program. Any questions about this information? Okay, I do want to make you aware of some resources that are available if you would like to do a deeper dive into preschool LRE. The first is a series that O'Calley put together called Preschool Special Education 101. And there are, I think, about 8 one-hour webinars on a variety of topics related to preschool special education. And LRE is one of those. So if you click on this page in the PDF, you'll be able to access this, and the link has also been posted in the chat. Additionally, here are a slew of preschool LRE resources. You can access them through the QR code. I've also posted the link in the chat. Most of these we reviewed already today, so they should be familiar to you, at least in terms of their purpose. And with that, I will open it up once again to any lingering questions or concerns around preschool LRE. Okay, Jen and Melissa, I don't know if one of you would like to chime in with upcoming happy hour events.
Yeah, so we have a couple more events coming up. So we're going to continue with section 11, the school age version of today on February 18th. And then you can see section 12 and 13 on March 4th. And then we'll be wrapping up the entire IEP on March 18th, sections 14 through 15, PRO2 and PRO1. And I'm posting in the chat the feedback link. So please share your feedback. And it's also on your screen. So thanks. We're on the same wavelength. And I'll also post in the chat. We are recording today, and it will be posted on our website. All of the past IEP Happy Hour sessions, the videos and the presentations are posted on our PD on demand section of our website. So you can check those out there. We appreciate you guys being on today.
If you need to go back and listen to this one again, feel free to play it at like 0.75 or 0.5 so you can digest the information in a more reasonable time frame. Thank you all so much for having me and hopping on for preschool section 11. If you have any follow-up questions, you are welcome to reach out to me. I'll put my contact information in the chat. Here is our final disclaimer. And Jen, if there's anything else to wrap up before we break for today.
I don't think so. Melissa, do you have any thoughts?
I guess it would just be if we have any last minute questions, and we may want to turn off the recording in case someone wants to ask a question and not have it be recorded.